George Hilary Akers was born June 18, 1926, to Hilary Bogle Akers and Kitty Smith Akers. He was born in the same modest clapboard house on the main street of the Eastern Shore Chesapeake fishing village of Rock Hall as his father and grandfather before him had been born. George was the middle child and only son of Hilary and Kitty. George's older sister Miriam was born in 1925, and his younger sister Eolin would follow 12 years later in 1938. George's father Hilary was Captain Akers, a master mariner in the Merchant Marine, licensed to captain ships of any size on any navigable waters in the world. And so it was that Captain Hilary Akers met George's mother Kitty in London and brought her home to start a new life and family in Rock Hall, Maryland. Because Captain Akers was often absent for months at a time on sea voyages, George grew up with the expectation that he must be the man of the family, with regular chores and responsibilities. However, George also had plenty of fun and activity and learned to love the Chesapeake Bay, where he swam and sailed on his small boat, his dog Jock often by his side. He retained a love of the sea and of sailing all his life. When George was entering 7th grade, his family had responded to an evangelistic crusade and joined the Rock Hall Seventh-day Adventist Church. As Providence would have it, the church also began a small grade school about the same time. George became a charter member and completed grades 7 and 8 at the church school. And so, in a simple one-room schoolhouse in the small fishing village of Rock Hall, began a lifelong experience with Christian education for George Akers. To say that George was a model student would be stretching the bounds of credibility. He was a bright and capable student always, but also an indifferent one, spending more time on games and goofing around, and always ready for a good joke or prank. It was after one particular incident with George, as usual in the center of it, that the teacher of the little Rock Hall school had George stay after class. But instead of the expected punishment, the hard-working and sincere Miss Sarita Lockstamfer spoke from her heart with words that made a lasting impression on young George. Do you want to have fun for a moment, or do you want to make a difference for eternity? You're made for better things than fun and games and getting laughs. And then she prayed with George and asked that the good Lord guide his future. And that simple incident with George's first Christian teacher planted the seed in George's mind, and he began to consider that he might have a part to play in shaping people's lives for the better. Following 8th grade graduation, George wanted to attend Shenandoah Valley Academy, but finances were mighty tight in the Akers household in 1939, so George completed his first 2 years of high school at Rock Hall High School. In the meantime, Kitty was cutting every available cost and putting the savings in an old oatmeal tin. Then in 1941, George was able to attend Shenandoah Valley Academy with the money his mother had faithfully saved as an entrance fee, and the rest coming from George's hard work at various jobs on campus. George graduated from Shenandoah Valley Academy in 1943, and still just 16 years of age, headed to Washington Missionary College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, to begin the constant process of working as many as 3 jobs to pay his tuition. Despite his many jobs, George was an active, energetic, and highly involved student who majored in religion with history and English minors. He also sang bass on the school quartet and was elected president of a senior class. When George graduated from WMC in 1947, he had several calls to the gospel ministry and one to be dean of boys at Ozark Academy. The idea of directly working with youth had been in the back of George's mind and growing. And so George, at 21 years of age, was off to Ozark Academy, where he served 3 years from 1947 to 1949. George entered the role of boys' dean with his customary enthusiasm and vigor. The first year was a great year for the academy and its new boys' dean. But something was wrong, and George vowed to make it right. So George was back on the campus of WMC in early June of 1948, and he came a-courting hard for the comely Miss Imogene Allen, who hadn't exactly been pining away waiting for his return as she prepared for her final year of college. In fact, the romance had sputtered early on when George couldn't get Imogene to change plans to attend a friend's wedding at the last minute to go to a concert with him. So he invited himself to the wedding. Over the course of a whirlwind romance that summer, Imogene was alternately put out and attracted to the sincere, exuberant, rough-hewn, and obviously talented George Akers. For his part, George was convinced that Imogene was the only girl for him and proposed an immediate marriage. It took several events that Imogene saw as God's leading, and all of George's considerable persuasive skills before Imogene finally said yes. And so the young lovers were married August 31, 1948. Then they spent a glamorous honeymoon, making the rush trip to Ozark Academy before the school year began. The next stop in the career of George Akers was Harvey, North Dakota, where he served as boys' dean of Cheyenne River Academy, a position he held for 3 years from 1949 to 1952. In addition to being fully involved with deaning, teaching, and surviving several major blizzards, a high point for the young couple was the birth of their first son, Douglas Allen Akers, on November 25, 1949. In 1952, George accepted a call to be principal of Philadelphia Academy, which included grades 1 through 12. Here, enrollment rose dramatically as a combination of George's knack for recruitment and his ability to articulate a shared message of purpose for the entire school family. One highlight the old Philadelphia Academy alumni still cherish are the more than 100 hymns committed to memory under George's watch. Every Sabbath, the exuberant teenagers would head off by bus to one of the area churches, where they would sing those old gospel hymns and cement them even tighter in their minds. Another auspicious moment during this time was the birth of second son Daniel Wayne Akers on August 13, 1953. Following the 1954 school year, George kept his promise to Imogene that she could complete college as he accepted a call to teach English at Tacoma Academy for the 1954-55 school year. With 2 young sons, Imogene couldn't go to college full-time. However, with the help of her parents who lived nearby, she was able to complete her last year's coursework in 2 years and complete her BA degree in music. In 1955, George accepted the invitation to be principal of Shenandoah Valley Academy, a position he held through 1959. During his tenure there, the school's enrollment more than doubled to 305, a major building campaign expanded and renovated the campus, and students and faculty alike learned that service was a key Christian value, and that Christian education could be both academically rigorous and spiritually enlightening. It was also during this time in 1956 that George completed his Master's in Education degree from Temple University. George's successful Temple University experience brought him to the conclusion, almost to his surprise, that the education he had received from Adventist schools had fully prepared him for the greater world of ideas and higher education. One did not have to choose between higher education and Christian education. A curriculum that integrated essential principles of faith and rigorous academic discipline was fully possible, and a fully Christian education did not have to deprecate either Christianity or academics. This conviction became a cornerstone of George's strong emphasis of the integration of faith and learning throughout his career. In 1959, George accepted a call to La Sierra College to be Dean of Students, a position he held for 3 years. In 1962, he was granted a 2-year leave of absence to pursue his Ph.D. at the University of Southern California. George's strong convictions on Christian education and character might have been at odds with a secular institution priding itself on rigorous academics. However, George's unique ability to grasp a philosophical concept and relate it within the context of a fully grounded faith impressed his academic advisors, who greatly encouraged his progress. He also counted it providential that he developed a close professional and personal relationship with Earl V. Pullius, a well-respected educator and man of faith. George had ample opportunity to further refine his vision for Christian education as a vital force to equip young people to engage the world without being overwhelmed by it. Never an isolationist, he often used the illustration of the elderly lady futilely sweeping back a flood tide from her porch, concluding with the challenge, do we dam up the Pacific Ocean, or do we teach our kids to swim? In 1964, George accepted the first of 3 calls to Andrews University. He completed his doctoral dissertation in the next 2 years while teaching full-time in the education department. In 1965, George accepted another position as superintendent of all the Andrews Laboratory schools, grades K through 12. At the same time, George was increasingly in demand to speak at teacher education conferences, weeks of prayer, and other events. Folk began to notice that not only was he an inspirational speaker with a lot of thought-provoking ideas, but he also looked a lot like this politician fellow Richard Nixon, an accident of genetics that would come full circle a bit later. The 60s were turbulent times of change and protest, which had a major impact on Doug, their oldest son. When he was drafted during the height of the Vietnam War, Doug chose to be a conscientious objector, not willing to support the war in any way. Rather than leave the country for Canada or otherwise evade the draft, Doug chose to directly respond to the draft board authorities, where he successfully established that his beliefs would not permit military service. Instead, he pursued alternate service in social work, a career that he followed for the rest of his life until his untimely death from leukemia in 2001. George served at Andrews through 1969, when he accepted a call to Walla Walla College to be academic dean, balancing demands of his new position with increasing demands for his time with recruitment and speaking. The stay at Walla Walla College was busy, but brief, and George accepted the call to be president of his alma mater, Columbia Union College, in 1970, where he served through 1974. The CUC years were full of events, with George continuing to advance the notion of Christian education as a pathway to service, and the Christian educator as one with a unique responsibility to awaken both the mind and the heart. While remaining keenly aware of the need for academic rigor and maintaining strong standards for accreditation and academic achievement, Akers also made it clear that the measure of a school is not brick and mortar, but what happens in the lives of its students. George was always an aggressive recruiter for the college. When he persuaded Darlene Sterner to attend CUC and be his student secretary, little did he know that he was actually recruiting his future daughter-in-law. Spooky, or Spooks as he affectionately called her for good reason, met Danny in the president's office when he breezed past her to hit up his dad for money. A romance later developed, and Darlene and Danny were married in 1972. No recounting of George's 4 years as president of Columbia Union College would be complete without mention of the infamous Camp David incident, which really did happen in 1970 as a spur-of-the-moment episode that became larger than life, requiring George to answer curious and amazed questions and to refute various rumors for the rest of his life. While he said that he came to rue the impulsive incident that he was afraid would overshadow anything else he had achieved in and for Christian education, it didn't prevent him from telling his story at audiences' urging for the last 45 years. George always loved telling a good story, and the Camp David incident, where George was mistaken for President Richard Nixon and admitted to Camp David while the president was actually there and taking a nap, was a whopper of a great story, made all the better because it was so improbable, so outlandish, and so true, as confirmed by a recent Freedom of Information request. The incident relates what the Secret Service considered to be a major security breach and tells, in tones of incredulity, of how an old green Cadillac with Oregon license plates, scruffy, bearded college students, and a man in the middle front seat who looked a little like a sweaty Richard Nixon in hiking clothes, managed to enter Camp David, triggering a major security furor, and perhaps ultimately improving a security plan that had never considered a presidential look-alike. In 1974, George returned to Andrews University for his second tour of duty, this time for 9 years. While Akers had the experience and background for many areas of education, including classroom teaching, curriculum and development, and leadership and management, his signature class was philosophy of Christian education, a topic he was passionate about and which influenced every class and discipline. While Akers' classes required the appropriate scholarship, study, and graduate-level projects, it was the interaction and discussion in class that had the most impact and influence on the students privileged to be in his classes. To George, the subject matter curriculum was important, but even more important was how the teacher related to his or her students, how they used the subject matter to challenge minds, to ignite a passion for learning while developing critical thinking capability, always grounded in a spiritual dimension.
We have the opportunity in a school to expose our children to the finest things of life, because they're going to whistle them, they're going to hum them, they're going to review them, they're going to put them on the walls of their mind, they're going to walk around and look at them. This flypaper mind of children and youth is what we work with. It's a very precious and wonderful thing. Out of a Christian school should come young people who have taken the high road unapologetically and say, I choose this, not because the school's got a regulation on it. I choose this, I prize this, I cherish this. I will organize my life around this ideal. I don't care what the principal says. I don't care what the pastor says. I don't care what mom and dad says. This is my internalized standard. It's mine now.
During this time at Andrews, Akers led the effort to establish religious education as a doctoral program and was the first dean of the School of Education at Andrews in the early 1980s. While Akers was fully and productively involved in the growth, development, and management of the new School of Education and his multiple classes, he continued to speak throughout the world on the topics he was passionate about: Christian education, the role of the teacher in school and character development, and the integration of faith and learning. During the years of George's second stint at Andrews, momentous things had also been happening in his family, and George first became a grandfather with the birth of Daneen and Darlene's daughter Daneen in 1976. Deeanne followed in 1979. Doug and his wife Nancy, or Nazz as he called her, gave George and Imogene their third and fourth grandchildren, with Kalle, born in 1985, and Cade in 1987. George was always a doting grandfather, delighted to play silly children's games, as well as dispensing grandfatherly wisdom and supporting them whenever possible through every major school and life event, including baptism, graduations, marriage, and the birth of his great-grandchildren Lily, Enoch, Thaddeus, Abel, and Lucy. While George had been happy to settle into the challenges of Andrews University's School of Education, Leadership, and Teaching, he was called to one more opportunity. As then GC President Neil Wilson had put it, to do some skywriting for Adventist education. And that's exactly what George did from 1985 to 1990, as he led the General Conference Education Department and coordinated the church's global education ministry. He also did a lot of sky traveling, logging thousands of miles as he traveled the world to encourage Christian teachers and emphasize the criticality of a truly Christian education. When George penned his first message as a principal, back at Philadelphia Academy in the early 1950s, he concluded that everything that happened at the school was a part of God's curriculum. What is a Christian school? It means more than scholasticism, more than just buildings, books, and credits. The words and context changed over the years, but George never wavered from that early conviction that what happens in the heart and mind for God is the most important purpose of a Christian school. When George's father, Hilary Akers, passed to his rest in 1969, the family assembled at the Little Rock Hall Church to say farewell. The church and gathering is larger today, but the words George used from the poet Edwin Markham to say farewell to his father are just as meaningful today as we say farewell to George Akers, devoted son, brother, father, husband, grandfather, and friend to all. As when a lordly cedar, green with boughs, goes down with a great shout upon the hills, and leaves a lonesome place against the sky.